remember State of Decay being a big deal back in 2013, coming in on the last leg of the Xbox 360's lifespan as a console-exclusive Xbox Live Arcade game. Zombie media had overtaken the public zeitgeist after the events of 9/11 through games like Half-Life 2, Left 4 Dead, Dead Space, Dead Rising, the zombie modes in Call of Duty, and even the Undead Nightmare DLC for Red Ded Redemption. Zombies were everywhere, but none had tried to do specifically what Undead Labs proposed in State of Decay, an open-world sandbox with survival elements like permadeath and resource management.
Nice.
My friends and I were ecstatic to jump in head first. Ultimately, I found the game's hook fun enough, but found it far too easy to just force of will my way through the game without paying much attention to its simulation aspects. But since both State of Decay 1 and 2 are on Game Pass right now, I thought it'd be interesting to revisit the first game almost a decade later and see how it's aged, if I feel any differently about it, and whether the sequel is a marked improvement or just more of the same.
Okay, you say so.
So let's get stuck in like a crowbar in a zombie skull.
I'm loaded up. See you back at base.
We'll see you soon.
You gonna sit around with your thumb up your ass or help out? You gonna sit around with your thumb up your ass or help out?
State of Decay's story and characters feel like if The Walking Dead were populated by The Sims, just edgeless normies constantly in need of your attention and care. The game world is set in Trumbull Valley, and you begin your post-apocalyptic life as Marcus Campbell, a gloriously afro jack-of-all-trades. You'll soon run into Maya Torres of the great melee skills and tight yoga pants, and then some other fairly generic survivors as well. The voice acting's fine,
Hi.
but there aren't so much characters as archetypes, and that's because State of Decay is a lot more interested in solving the persistent day-to-day problems of a zombie outbreak than worrying about character drama.
Whatever you say.
You can switch between any character in your group and each have their own skill sets, like being able to shoot more accurately or able to loot with a less likely chance of making racket and attracting zombies.
I'm lucky they didn't hear that.
You'll often need to switch off because characters become tired from their time abroad, and their health and stamina start to cap at lower and lower thresholds, kind of like how your health bar decreases after each death in Dark Souls 2. If their morale gets too low, they can even snap, harming other survivors or leaving your community entirely. My favorite aspect of the survivors is the ability to enlist one at a time to accompany you indefinitely. I'm always a big fan of party systems like a good old BioWare RPG, and while the AI can get stuck on things, fail to follow you, or provide very poor backup from time to time, they're generally pretty nice to have around and can at least provide a distraction if nothing else. Now, if any of your survivors die, they're gone for good. You'll definitely need to treat these folks with care because they aren't immediately replaceable, as the game meets out new recruits very sparingly. The name of the game is Preparedness. Okay, technically the name of the game is State of Decay, but like the underlying gameplay pressure is Preparedness. Before you go out on a supply run or a mission, you'll want to make sure you're outfitted with a melee weapon, a gun, and some number of healing and stamina restoring consumables. You'll withdraw these resources from your home base, which starts off with a decent supply of stuff, and any further outpost you build require a set amount of materials and influence to construct. Each resource you extract costs influence, and each item you place there adds to the grand total. As the days turn over, the number of zombies increases, and your influence will reset to half of your fame stat, which is earned by completing missions, helping survivors, and building facilities. The influence currency also affects what radio columns you can use, which act like lifelines or kill streaks, where you can request survivors to come pick up resources that you found but don't have the room to carry back, or you can request a vehicle or an airstrike and some other increasingly useful options as you progress. So once you've geared up, you'll often have several mission types to choose from, like a story mission, or maybe training a newbie or helping them cope with stress by going out and committing Zeticide. What's a little strange is how the game meets these out to you. They aren't all available one after the other, but sort of randomly generate ever so often, notifying you by radio. Now, many zombie lore conventions appear here, but State of Decay is more interested in making you think about how to engage these conventions rather than trying to reinvent them.
That, my friend, is how we do it.
The game feels a little bit like a zombie Oregon Trail.
I'm gonna eat your ass. I'm an ass eater anyway.
The game often shortchanges its survival sim DNA though, feeling very scripted or even offering no time to respond or roleplay. One time, I was driving towards the courthouse to see if I could trigger a new story mission, when a call came over the radio about the courthouse being attacked by zombies. I got there quite quickly and was greeted with the message that 2 named NPCs had just died. I had barely gotten a hit in before the mission ended because the NPCs had presumably killed all the zombies already. Now, was this scripted, or could I have saved any of these folks? And if so, why was I given no time to react? A similar instance occurred when I was out just doing my thing and was told that our priest was sick. Another survivor was worried the priest would turn and get everyone else sick, so he killed the priest in cold blood shortly thereafter. Were there ways around this, or was this scripted? Reading up on permutations of this event on the State of Decay wiki indicates there are ways around it, but they're very unintuitive. But this is just cheating a broken system. The game never implies this is a rational road to success, so you'd have no reason to choose it naturally. The cause and effect chain in State of Decay feels like smoke and mirrors. The times it does actually require you to pay attention to its intricacies, it boils down to tedious supply runs over and over again to fill up a meter so your group of dumbasses don't freak out. I won't pretend to enjoy the tedium of the average survival game anyway, and I'm no expert in the deeper levels of State of Decay, but you're not really compelled to pay attention to the game's subtleties anyway, so there's not much reward in avoiding the path of least resistance. And that's one of my major inner conflicts about this game. I don't personally want a brutally prescriptive survival game from State of Decay, like, Subnautica or The Long Dark or whatever, but nor do I want to play just a breezy third-person action game with just weaker controls and writing.
I'm confused.
I'll admit, it's a guilty pleasure to be allowed to sidestep the game's systems like this, but being able to do so defeats the purpose of its premise, and reveals that third-person action and exploration haven't been married well enough to the base building, resource management, and stat crunching. Most problems can just simply have warm bodies and aggression thrown at them to be solved, which brings us to the combat. Offensive options in State of Decay vary wildly from satisfying to frustrating. Gunplay is the least polished. Despite their welcome damage output, guns are hard to aim, have inconsistent hit detection, and are somewhat of a liability because you can't manually reload, only being able to initiate this action if you've run out of ammo in a magazine, or if you want, you can go into the menu, select the gun, and click reload, which, by the way, doesn't even pause the game. State of Decay is definitely not going to be competing with Gears of War's gunplay anytime soon or anything, which I'm sure is mostly by design. Fortunately, the melee combat fares much better. Melee weapons come in many different varieties of form and effectiveness, but they will all eventually break if used enough. Be aware of that yellow image of your melee weapon that shows up on screen, indicating that breakage is imminent. One time I didn't pay attention, my weapon broke, and I was promptly mauled because the backup default knife is the weakest melee weapon in gaming history, which makes sense balance-wise, but not IRL. Anyway, the melee weapons all felt pretty good, and once you've hit a zombie enough times, they'll fall on all fours or kneel, and you can finish them off with a disgustingly crunchy insta-kill. Chaining these together will really make you feel like a god. All good press aside though, the hit detection here is weird too, sometimes working beautifully, and other times you'll end up swinging and missing again and again, tanking your stamina and getting killed, which is super frustrating. Speaking of zombie bites, we should take some time to know thy enemy real quickly. Your standard Zed just needs to be softened up or pushed down to finish off, but other special zombies known as freaks are a fun mix of challenging and terrifying, like the extremely agile ferals. Screamers can knock your stamina low and alert other zombies with their scream. Bloaters explode when near the player, and their bile will tank your health and stamina unless you move out of the effective area. This even includes vehicles somehow. The real test of your metal are the iconic juggernauts. These fat fucks can take a ton of damage, too much if you ask me, before going down, and can clear you out with just a couple hits. Fortunately, as nightmare-inducing as they look and sound, they don't like getting hit with your car bumper any more than the other zombies, although hitting them will tear up your vehicle much faster than normal. Now believe it or not, the greatest melee weapons in the game are actually the vehicles. They always start right up and never run out of gas. You're able to knock zombies off your driver's side by slamming the door into them, and to keep them off the passenger side, you'll need to ram something or drive at high speeds and swerve, ending with a satisfying, physics-accurate jettison of your undead carjacker. I don't know if you could reasonably call this game GTA Z, but it definitely has some of the fun that series is known for built into its vehicle controls. Ramming zombies is the most effective way to clear out infestations, and your vehicles can take a metric butt ton of damage before exploding. The game clearly knows this too, as important story missions gate off access except by foot to maintain some sense of dread and challenge. What kind of sucks though is how fences and walls aren't destructible, which feels glaringly unrealistic and outdated when you're having to drive around waist-high little obstacles just to get through an opening because nothing breaks apart when driven through. The collision physics are also brutal to contend with. Fortunately, the cars are very forgiving in how they control, so aside from how slow they are to start up, they're always pretty enjoyable to drive around in. It's also pretty hilarious to drive damaged vehicles where the tires have been torn off and you're just kind of creeping down the highway on your rims. All that to say, vehicles are the most important items in the game. You'll need them to get around because you can't hope to rely on your stamina bar forever, and you need to make sure you aren't picked off by the roaming zombie hordes, and the vehicles kill faster than anything else. Going into any new area and noting where the vehicles are is crazy important. Now, vehicles are a big crutch, but I'm mostly okay with that because of how janky the rest of the game is. The frustration of losing your favorite character to permadeath from a momentary bad break is pretty disheartening. Now, to a large degree, I guess that's kind of the point. The frantic escapes, like making it out of a horde's reach while keeling over from exhaustion or jumping out of a window and making a break forward, are just exhilarating, and an adrenaline rush very few zombie games can replicate. But the sheer amount of times the game wigs out and something goofy sends your survivals to an early death really shatters the illusion quite a bit. I even died once trying to grab footage for a stupid visual joke. There was a flaming airplane lying in a grassy field and the joke was, look, there's planes on the plains. But as I drove back across this area and tried to avoid a juggernaut on a dime, my vehicle hit a rock or something, and I flew into the air, fell out of my ride, and got promptly lunched upon. So the moral is, don't let your memes be dreams, although sometimes they can become nightmares if you pursue them. Okay, well that one was probably on me, but the rest of my mishaps are pretty frustrating. I guess it only makes sense that my cap-wearing, fishing jacket-clad redneck made it to the end because he was my last playable character and saved the day. You can't keep Country Strong down, I guess. Even then, it took me a couple tries to get through the lame ending fight because of a scripting error that wouldn't trigger the final cutscene. So, yeah, that's my experience with State of Decay, my second playthrough coming almost a decade after the first, and my opinion not changing a whole lot. I didn't fool with the DLC for this one, as it wasn't included in the Game Pass version and looked generally like more of the same, but just harder, so, you know. Oh boy. One thing I never noticed until researching for this project, and which I can't forget to mention, is how good the music is. The game keeps it quite subtle by mixing it very low, so you wouldn't be faulted for not paying it much attention, but it's so worth listening to on its own. It's classic Walking Dead style stuff, sort of spaghetti western with classical overtones, right in the sonic vein of Assassin's Creed 2 and Darksiders 2, two games that I knew sounded alike but didn't quite know why until I realized they were both composed by Jesper, also known for the first entries in the Borderlands and Hitman franchises. So yeah, the game's music punches way above the quality of the rest of the game, which is more of a testament to kids' talent than Undead Lab's lack thereof, but still, it's cool when the individual parts of a project stand up so well on their own. Now as for the game itself, it sits in a middle ground between survival simulation and third-person action, and has some of the truly best frantic, skin-of-your-teeth moments in zombie gaming. And while I'm not super keen on demanding survival games and was happy to be let off the hook here, I did feel like the game is defeating its own purpose but not requiring me to engage with the systems all that much. Managing your stamina so you don't get overwhelmed is the most pressing combo of survival and action design, and it's the stress point that the game thrives on but also often buckles under. Its controls not being up to the task and leaving me feeling robbed several times when the deaths of important characters felt like the game's fault and not mine. So while not perfect, this is an ambitious and promising start to the series from the upstart Undead Labs. And on that note, let's see how the sequel fared.
Let me go find more. I'm cool with that.
Undead Labs had been under contract with Microsoft as a partner since 2011 and were fully bought up by the time State of Decay 2 released in 2018. So they had Microsoft's money, blessing, and watchful eye guiding an even bigger team this time around, and it shows, but not as impactfully as you might expect. The game runs on Unreal Engine 4, so it looks a good deal better than its predecessor, which ran on CryEngine 3. Character models are still fairly basic looking, but the comic book level of bold color contrast really makes areas pop. Nighttime is now legitimately dark and oppressively creepy unless you've got a light guiding your way. The music is yet again by Jesper, and yet again it slaps unconditionally. Yet again, I felt like it wasn't nearly present enough in the mix, but it's another banger you can totally listen to on its own and appreciate its drama and artistry totally independent of any visuals. The soundtrack's just got a really interesting resonance of tone, and I wish I could figure out what that percussive stringed instrument is that Kid uses in both State of Decay games, and which gives Assassin's Creed 2 and Darksiders 2 that classically reverent yet modern sound. Maybe it's just an acoustic guitar plugged into an amp, but man does it sound exotic and culturally blended and just heckin' cool. Anyway, when you start a new game, you choose from several different survivor pairs and one of 5 different starting maps, all with different geographical advantages like mountains and different starting bases. Regardless of which you choose though, many of their roadways are constructed in similar ways to Metal Gear Solid 5 in that when in close to settlements, they're narrow and wind between mountain faces but gradually open into expanses of farmland that are fun to drive through. And while there are a few too many broken down cars that barely leave room for your vehicle to get through, now all non-brick items are destructible, so your joyriding isn't being constantly stopped by every random asset on the ground. Roadways are much less populated by the undead than the first game too, at least on default difficulty, which is a new feature for the series. There are 5 difficulties on offer, and they can get really rough if that's your fancy, turning up all the sliders like a mad lad. You'll still set up your home base and satellite outpost, make workshops and med stations to repair, craft weapons and medicine, and you can even add mods to your base to aid in how efficiently this power supply runs and other such bonuses. I could go into specifics here, but the minutia is really only important to the grinder of high difficulties who needs every last inch of help to survive, and I imagine there are other better videos on these finer points. Vehicles require fuel now to drive, and they're not always gassed up when you find them. Inventory management is largely the same. The ability to call in scavengers to pick up rucksacks and such has been removed, so all the heavy lifting is now your responsibility. But nicely, you can access your followers' inventory now and use them as a pack mule if necessary. The controls are pretty similar to the first game with some notable changes. Combat animations look nice and have some good impact, but feel canned, kind of like in an MMO or a turn-based game when you sort of square up and lock onto an enemy and do the animation in place. You don't have the freedom anymore to swing analog style and hit more than one enemy, and the hit detection's still really finicky, as is input delay or unresponsiveness, especially when trying to finish off down zombies. Getting stuck in crowds is also a nightmare because too many contextual functions are mapped to the same input, like how the new finishing moves are mapped to the same input as entering or exiting a vehicle, which is super bad when you're trying to drive away from a horde, not continually trying to kill zombies on the ground. Another pain is how the kick button can take precedence even when you're using the same button to try to escape a horde by jumping through a nearby window. Much like the controls, environments, and graphics, the simulation aspects haven't been reinvented much, but lightly built upon. They still aren't very deep, but they are more immediate and unavoidable this time around, which is good news for those of us who want to feel like they're being challenged more to keep up with resources, maintain relationships with other camps, and all that good stuff. But the changes here also introduce a new mechanic that becomes a brutal cycle of failure unless you figure out the shockingly simple trick, which took me a bit longer to figure out than I'd like to admit. State of Decay 2 heavily emphasizes what's called blood plague. If you get hit enough times by blood red zombies, you'll become infected and have 3 game hours to cure yourself with a special medicine. Another way to catch the plague is exposure to it from the AoE attack of the plague hearts themselves, which are the source of the plague. These nasty blobs are kind of like MMO public event bosses, as they're spongy and spawn in zombies to defend themselves as you wail on them. Once defeated, they drop a ton of loot and plague zombies no longer spawn in the area. Primary objective of each community's playthrough is taking out all 10 of these per region. Much like the first game, I thought I could out attrition the game by desperately throwing my survivors at these plague hearts, but I ended up contracting plague over and over again and getting my survivors killed as I took down heart after heart. Soon, my community was ravaged, my resources shot, and with only 2 survivors left, both of which had blood plague.
God, I'm tired.
So I took a long break to play something less stressful and wondered if I'd even be able to complete the second game to make this review. When I came back, I started a new community and tried what seems obvious now, but it made all the difference. I started again in Trumbull Valley this time, as I was excited to see how the first game's area had changed. Then I went after those plague hearts with everything I had, carrying a bare minimum of health and stamina items, and loading up the rest of my inventory entirely with guns and explosives. It turns out the only real way to break the cycle of catching the plague every time I was trying to take out the source of it was to completely commit all resources to just DPSing the damn things to death before they can spawn in all their nefarious minions. And going back to my preparedness dogma, I had to regroup after each encounter and not be above going on supply runs for meds just to make plague cures, get everyone back up to full health and stamina, or swap to someone who is rested, and repeat. Intentionality and patience were key, and once I practiced these virtues, the game broke wide open. My strategy even working as I picked back up my seemingly doomed first community playthrough and managed to complete it as well with only the 2 survivors. Felice and McCullough, y'all the real ones. Now, while I had a satisfying personal journey cracking this, well, rather obvious nut, this was really the game's only mystery, and once solved, you realize how shallow the whole thing is. After knocking out all 10 hearts in the region, I did a couple story missions before a message unceremoniously popped up on a screen right as I entered a zombie horde. It didn't even have the good graces to pause the game but asked me if I was okay doing this last mission, as it would close up my playthrough with this community. My first successful community, which is my second technical playthrough, had a sheriff as my leader, which meant I had a showdown with a gang in the end mission. And by showdown, I traveled all the way to a factory building, shot 1 or 2 people at the bottom, then went up a ladder and shot 2 or 3 more. If I hadn't been so scared of dying, it could have taken me a couple of minutes and then it was game over. The ending cutscene is also comically wooden, from the hand-waving motion and all these platitudes.
Why stop here? If we can do this once, we can do it again, right?
Would you say 10 million? No, I don't think 10 million.
I mean, that's how we win this thing, working together, one town at a time.
You serious?
Most of all, there was just this feeling of, was that it? Now, State of Decay 1's ending was far short of epic, and even that had more craft and personality to it than the 2 I'd played in State of Decay 2, both of which ended up in the same building and had the same silly ending cutscene. Fortunately, in my original playthrough that I resurrected, my community leader was Felice the Trader, and she was invited to a trade summit that was crashed by raiders and then zombies up to and including a juggernaut, so at least that was mildly exciting. Unfortunately, once I was done with State of Decay 2, the Heartland DLC promised to be a lot more of what I wanted out of the main game, but even that petered out by the end.
What, you expecting a picnic? Toughen up, kid.
This story-driven side content is mostly the perfect balance of State of Decay's formula. You'll pick from several duos of characters with a light backstory attached. I, of course, had to pick the badass bald ex-cop Quincy with the sniper rifle and his friend Helena, and off we went. Heartland takes place in Trumbull Valley, so it went very much like my other playthrough, but this time with a much more present plotline. Conversations are funnier and more engaging as the roster of characters is much smaller and more intentionally crafted.
Yeah, don't make a federal case out of it.
And the mission structures incorporate the basics like supply runs and base building into the context of the story so it doesn't just feel like busy work. Unfortunately, as much fun as I was having with the basics, the one new mechanic proved my undoing. Unlike the Plague Heart Cinderella story of the main game, I did not conquer the newest mutation of the plague, which are plague walls. You must construct plague busters from bloater glands to take down these walls' protective coating long enough to damage its 3 health bars, but while doing so, these walls spawn in tons of regular zombies as well as 2 juggernauts. 1 juggernaut is oppressive, and 2 is just preposterous for how much firepower you can actually carry and how much is needed to take them down. I've read ridiculously weird ways to beat this part of the game, but it's like the deepest and most obscure strategies in the base building aspect of the game, and after feeding my whole team to these fucking assholes, I just dipped out. I'm good. Thank you. What? Undead Labs? What's wrong? Oh, nothing. I'm fine. Nothing's the matter.
Would you mind slowing down a bit?
So, after editing that last salty section and realizing that hours of in-game footage for Heartland was just gone somehow, even though I rewatched it when I was in pre-production, and I know it existed, I resolved today that I was going to come back like Jordan from an early retirement and beat the Heartland DLC for real this time. This time taking into account the advice to use a builder as my base leader so I could build a sniper tower that would let me call in snipers as I took out plague walls, as well as using the new knowledge that using plague busters as nukes for any and all zombies, not just the walls themselves, was the key to success. I was stoked to get back in there and try again. But my next playthrough, just a couple minutes ago, wouldn't stop glitching out on supply runs where it wouldn't recognize that I'd scavenged an area fully, and thus I couldn't satisfy the influence level needed to advance the story. So, fuck you, State of Decay 2! I am so stoked this is an issue in your game within the first hour of a DLC that's 3 years old now. But wait, there's more. After having my fill of yet another unfun wrinkle in Heartland's design, I decided to give the game's new multiplayer mode a try before hanging up my Lucille. I enlisted my go-to co-op partner in crime and unwitting victim Shkotchki, and we got to work saving the Providence Ridge map. Everything I'd read said that you join one player's community and choose to play as one of their survivors, but when I joined Shkotchki's game, it let me come over as Feliz, my trusty trader who's now a jack of all trades. Even Wences showed up at my base, my Latin friend whom I know died in my main playthrough. Funny story, this guy actually died in my game, and the game somehow didn't remember it, and he was just there when I came back.
Okay.
But what? Like, I saw this man actually get eaten alive, and the game's like, no, he got better. This should have tipped me off that all was not right, and may have likely been a change to the game made since the information I read was disseminated. Yeah, I hate that word too. So I joined in as Feliz, and we went off to make supply runs and destroy plague hearts.
Oh!
Fuck. No.
Oh, sorry. Get in the car.
The best possible outcome to that. Our time with Decay 2 made it very apparent that despite 5 years of dev time plus all the time they spent updating the game since, the multiplayer feels very tacked on still because it's barely interested in the player who's moonlighting in another person's game. Sure, I can drive a car or kill a zombie just like anyone else, but I couldn't talk to anyone to initiate quests, I couldn't access any followers' inventories to make them carry stuff, and I had to wait for the primary player to loot plague hearts and most major containers before I could access them. Now I can understand this choice as a way to buffer the game against griefers and pests, but surely if I'm a friend of the primary player, I can be trusted to do this. Why wouldn't there be a slider to adjust this in case someone wanted their sidekick to actually be helpful and I'd have to wait around for everyone else to initiate every important task? I felt like an island with very little input into the success of how our tasks went. Not to mention the inventory system or trading between players is silly and requires you to drop and pick up literally everything. Even the supply locker seems cordoned off just to reflect what the base game has for your particular character.
Oh, there's another shotgun here, so I can give it to you at base, I think, right?
You put it in the supply locker.
This entire town will be under our watch.
So I start the gun in there.
Hopefully it shows up, because I don't see a gun in there in that community locker right now. Yeah, it doesn't show me the shotgun.
That's weird.
Well, that's another strike against the way they constructed this. Again, I guess it makes some sense that you wouldn't just be able to let people ferry a whole arsenal from their late game playthrough and boost another playthrough like Thanos and ENDGAME, but is that really such a big deal? What is it that's preventing other than just more fun? This reminded me of the crushing disappointment that was Fable 2's multiplayer, where you were supposedly going to be able to so wide-rangingly influence your co-op partner's world that you could kill their spouse or change quests entirely based on your involvement. And that was a lie then, and it feels like the same boring, bare-bones implementation here too. You're very much just a bystander, a passerby in another player's world, and the lack of actual cooperation or ability to help loot or start conversations really punctuates why this series still feels so undercooked despite its many promises. So yeah, that's the state of Decay in the year of our Lord 2022. Having been super hyped like most people were back in 2013 to see a zombie game with some actual depth, I'm sad to report that while the games are fine, they never really seem to fully embrace their potential.
Keep that mouth shut.
Some people are going to really love these games just as they are, and that's totally fine, and I don't mean that in just a different strokes to different folks kind of way. These are still totally functional, often decent little third-person action games with survival game flavoring. They still have some of the most white-knuckles gameplay out there in the zombie genre as you manage your stamina, weapon durability, and make sure you brought the right equipment with you. Now that's tight, but I often feel like the survival elements that aren't directly tied to immediate physical performance are kind of nebulous or tedious to engage, as they often just amount to copious supply runs that always seem to spawn stuff as far away as possible, making sure you use nearly all of your gas if you had any to begin with. And don't get me started again on how confused the game gets by your inputs, especially in tight situations, and how often the smallest thing can unseat your character and fuck up your playthrough in unfun ways. Games like these live and die by gameplay too, as the story and writing have all the conviction of bad commercials.
God bless.
I wish the series also didn't just feel like a race to find the exploit, like vehicles in State of Decay 1 and explosives and guns to DPS plague hearts before the fight even really begins in 2. Now I can recommend at least one playthrough of State of Decay because it does have some pretty fun emergent moments, like that one narrow escape across the countryside that felt so satisfying, or that one fight you just barely won with your last resources. But even after 2 games, the series has done very little to capitalize on its potential, adding just a slightly better gameplay loop and some really mediocre multiplayer. I'm all for State of Decay 3, which is currently in development, but if the second game is of any scientific import, Undead Labs may just see fit to see this series shamble along in its comfort zone until it dies for good and is finally put in the ground to stay.